Hello and welcome to this new video about Blender's interface. I thought it would be interesting to take a break and talk to you about the user interface. Because I often encourage people who own a 3D printer to learn how to 3D model by themselves. That's why I do this series of tutorials, by the way. But very often people tell me that Blender scared them. Just by opening the software and coming face to face with all these tools, all these panels, and all these menus, they think that Blender is too complex and they closes the software directly. I find it's a shame because the strength of this software is to be adapted to all needs. It allows you to carry out very complex professional projects, but it is also very easy to handle for much simpler projects such as modeling for 3D printing. So in this video I'm going to try to lift this interface barriers by explaining to you how it works. Like all softwares, Blender's interface is built with blocks of content, organized in a certain way, and this organization is called a layout. I don't really know how to define the word layout. It comes to us from the printing trades, in particular from press. For example, a magazine or a newspaper is built with a specific layout with blocks of titles, columns, inserts, etc. For those who work in the web, it may be meaningful for you because the layout is the division of a web page made with CSS style and HTML tags. So here we are on a layout that divides the screen into 4 areas, with a vertical or horizontal split. This layout is not fixed. We can resize it by dragging the separation line between 2 areas. We can add an area by cutting an area in 2, either vertically or horizontally. So here we have now 5 areas. And we can even delete areas, for that we can merge 2 of them by right-clicking on the separation line, choose Join Areas, and choose which areas is eaten by the other. And so if we can remove an area, that means each tool in each area is not essential. There are also 2 fixed bars at the top and bottom. The top one contains the generic file menu to load, to save a project, to import and export, etc. We also have the classic edit menu, and also a render menu to output images. And next to it, we have a series of tabs, but we'll see that a little later in this video. The bottom bar is very interesting. I recommend that you take a look at it from time to time. It displays information and suggests keyboard shortcuts depending on what you are doing. Now let's see what is inside each areas. In each area you can display editors. An editor is a toolbox. There are tools for all types of use. Some are very specialized in a particular task such as animation, mapping, shading, etc. And some others editors are useful for several types of work. Here we have the 3D viewport editor, the one that allows us to have visual feedback and transform an object with the mouse. Here we have the editor called Outliner, which allows us to organize our objects. Here the Properties editor, and they're the timeline editor used for animation. Look at the upper left corner of each area. There is this small button with a different pictogram. And if you click on it, the list of all editors is displayed. If you click on one of these editors, it will be assigned to the area. For example here, instead of displaying the timeline editor in this area, we could modify the layout and assign a second 3D viewport to this area. It can be useful to work with 2 different viewpoints at the same time. And so there we understand that each pictogram represents an editor. The grid with the sphere is the 3D viewport. The small graduations are the property editor, etc. So here it is. Blender's interface is simply a box system, and you just put the tools you want in each box. You could tell me, there are so many editors. That's why Blender is complicated. So yes, there are a lot of editors. But to model miniatures for 3D printing, we will use 3 or 4, maximum 5. We will review them all so you will understand. 3D viewport. This one is essential. We have already seen it together, and therefore we will of course use it. Image editor. This is not at all essential. It simply allows you to display an image in one of the areas. I use it to display references while I work, so why not? Anyway, it is very simple to use. UV editors are for mapping when using textures, which we don't do in 3D printing, so it's useless. The compositor, also useless. It is used to create visual effects or do post-production, nothing to do with 3D printing. The texture node editor, which is super cool by the way, because it allows you to create procedural textures, that is to say textures generated using algorithm and programming using box and nodes, but it's still texture so it won't help us either. Geometry editor node is used to generate objects by also programming with a box and node system. It's very powerful, but for what we have to do in our case, I really don't think we're going to need it. Here is the shader editor. Shaders are the materials that we are going to apply to our objects, so they'll look like a real-world thing after rendering, like wood, metal, stone, or anything else. But we don't produce images, we don't render, we want to 3D print. So we won't use the shader editor. I never use the video sequencer or movie clip editor, but generally anything related to video won't be useful for 3D modeling. Then we move on to animation-related editors. So we have the dope sheet, for example. It's a tool that allows you to place animation in a sequence over time and duration. We also have the timeline that we've already seen. Animation can be useful when you start creating different poses for a character. We can animate the character from a pose to another pose, and then export the model at different times of the animation. But you can already have a lot of fun and create very cool things before learn how to animate. So we won't use all these editors for now. Here we have the editors which are used to script. Scripting is great. I'm not a developer, so I just tinker with things to automate repetitive or boring tasks. I'll show you that in a next video, but if you're a programmer yourself, you should be very interested. It uses the Python language, and if you search the internet you'll find plenty of resources and detailed API documentation at the Blender website. I think is really something to explore if you know how to script. Next, the outliner. I would do a tutorial about the outliner because it's very useful. Basically, when your project starts to contain a lot of objects, this editor allows you to organize all that with groups you can then display, hide, select, and do lots of other things. So as one is really advised. The property editor is super important as well. It's where we can make a lot of adjustments to our objects, where we can also adjust the display and do a whole bunch of things. We'll see its usefulness on a case-by-case basis in future tutorials, but keep in mind you are going to use this editor. The file browser is therefore a file explorer. I think it can be useful, but in our case, we are not going to use a lot of external resources so well, we are not going to use it. The Assets Browser Editor, we already saw it quickly in the tutorial where we did some kit bashing. So it's great to organize different poses of a figure. You can save or apply different poses to a character. We are not going to use it right away, but we will do a tutorial about this editor. With the spreadsheet editor we can inspect geometry with numbers. I guess it can be useful when scripting, in order to have numerical data to use in our scripts, but it won't be useful for 3D modelization by hand. And finally, the preferences. It allows us to have the preferences always displayed in the layout. I really don't see how it's useful. So you see, we don't use that much editors. Basically, we only need the 3D viewport, the outliner, and the property editor, and in fact we already have them all here. So we're going to remove this zone, as I already explained, by merging those two areas and choosing the zone to delete. and we go back to a very simple basic layout. Now we will see what are these tabs. These tabs simply allow us to display other layouts. Layouts pre-designed and created exactly as I showed you by drawing areas and assigning editors to them. These pre-created layouts are called workspaces because they have been designed to offer different workspaces for different types of tasks. For example, if we display the scripting workspace, someone from Blender's team has concocted a small layout for us with all the editors useful for scripting, with the text editor, the Python console, etc. Same for animation. Here we have a layout with the dope sheet, the assets browser, the 3D viewport, everything we need to animate in good conditions. So you see, workspaces are not tools strictly speaking, they're just a way of telling you, hey, you want to do animation? I can get you all the tools you need in one click. And besides, we're going to see common editors in several workspaces, like the 3D viewport for example, which we're going to find almost all the time. I insist on this so that you understand that it is not as if each tab was a drawer that hides tons of new tools to learn. Our entire toolbox is here, and Blender doesn't hide other tools somewhere else. So in conclusion, if you master all of these editors, you master Blender 100%. I am not explaining all this to encourage you to use these tabs, but to make you understand these tabs are not super important, you can just ignore them. By the way, I find that as they are placed and always visible, a too disproportionate place has been granted to them. And not all workspaces are visible here, you can find others in the Add Workspace menu. And you can even delete them. It shows they are not essential to use Blender. And you can also create workspace. For example, if you want a workspace as minimal as possible, if you want to focus on pure modeling without using any other function for instance, you can add a new workspace, based on the basic layout for example, so we can duplicate this layout. Then delete all the areas, except the 3D viewport. Then we can rename the workspace Minimal. And here we have a very simple workspace, which will be similar to Tinkercad or SketchUp, but much more powerful. And you can switch from one to the other very easily. Note that layout changes are saved to your file. If you create a new project, our minimal layout has disappeared and the layout geometry node reappeared. So don't be afraid to delete or modify a layout. Everything you do is reversible. And if you don't want to lose your custom layouts, you can save a blank project with your layouts. So here we could create again a minimal workspace by deleting all the areas except the one where we have the 3D viewport. Save the project by calling it New Project Layout Minimal. And if you start a new project from this file, you will have your minimal workspace and all layout modification you did available. If we look closely, we can see all the panels and menus you can see here. They belong to the 3D viewport editor, so we're not going to talk about them now, but you'll learn how to use them on a case-by-case basis in the next videos. And that's all for this video. I hope you feel a little more comfortable now that we've broken down Blender's user interface. See you soon in the next video.